Well, another case of collusion comes to the fore. This time it is about collusion amongst pharmaceutical giants and the supply for cancer drugs. Commissioner Thembinkosi Bonakele made the announcement at a briefing at the Department of Trade and Industry headquarters in Pretoria.
Good news for those living with cancer and dependent on life-saving cancer drugs. The Competition Commission has officially launched an investigation into the exorbitant pricing of these drugs by the pharmaceutical industry.
Aspen increased the cost of unsubstitutable and life-saving cancer drugs by between 300 and 1,500%. Similarly, in the UK and Spain, Aspen is alleged to have attempted to sell cancer medicines in Europe for up to 40 times their previous prices.
Pfizer, Aspen and Roche have been suspected of alleged excessive pricing, abuse of dominance and exclusionary conduct.
The biggest thing we're investigating is pricing. We think prices are excessive, and this is evidenced by the medical aid schemes sometimes refusing to cover the full cost of drugs and patients having to pay for them.
The Commission confirms that breast cancer treatment is unaffordable in South Africa, and many medical aid schemes refuse to pay for the treatment based on high costs. We asked citizens how they feel about the prices of medication, and this was the response.
I think it's exorbitant prices. I mean, we pay exorbitant amounts for medical aids and that, and we still have to pay for, medication. And medical aids pay some of it, but a lot is not paid through the medical aid, and it actually sucks.
I am pleading to our government and pharmaceutical industries to be considerate to poor people like us, to reduce high prices of medication. We don't earn much, and people our age are constantly ill.
Medication is very expensive, and if it's possible, I mean, it'll be really good if the prices would come down, because most of us can't afford it.
South Africa's exorbitant pharmaceutical pricings are amongst the highest in the world. The Competition Commission investigation will lead to remedial action. Aspen, Pfizer and Roche are yet to face the heat. Hlengiwe Mutaung, ANN7, Pretoria.
And for now, joining us to unpack further details is oncologist Dr. Shaun Moodley, joining us live from Cape Town, and also joining us on the phone line is medical expert Dr. Terrence Kommal. Well, a very good afternoon, or rather good morning to both of you, and thank you so much for joining us this morning right here on Morning Prime at 8 and 7. I'll start off with you, Dr. Moodley. Just what do you make of the announcement made by the Competition Commission on the alleged colluding of cancer medication prices by some of the leading pharmaceutical companies in South Africa?
It's very difficult to make sense of what's happening presently, given that it's actually a very complex issue. And the complexities start all the way with legislation and come down to individual companies and how they price particular products. So, I mean, if you look at, simply speaking, prices of drugs, well, that's governed by Department of Health and in the legislation, and it's something called SEP, which is single exit price. And that single exit price is governed by benchmarking against 5 other countries in the world that theoretically has the same GDP as we do. So it's the Department of Health that governs how much these medications are allowed to be charged for. So it's a very difficult concept for me to wrap my head around in terms of costing.
Well, also joining us on the phone line is Dr. Terrence Kommal. Dr. Terrence Kommal, thank you so much for joining us this morning right here on Morning Prime. Well, Mr. Dr. Moodley has made mention that this is an intense and very complex issue. What do you make of this entire matter at hand?
I do believe that it is a very, very complex matter. But we've got to be cognizant that although South Africa functions to some extent like a first world country, we still have third world challenges and demands. So as much as we can pace and benchmark ourselves, the DOH doesn't itself only establish the pricing. It's given input by research and information from the actual drug importers and drug companies themselves. Now, the reality is a lot of these drugs can be procured for a fraction of those costs from the major producers who manufacture for most of the developing and developed world, like India and other sources. The challenge is bringing those prices down when you have all of the manufacturers benchmarking against more developed nations. Now, as much as I agree with my colleague, and I respectfully also disagree, as much as we benchmark with similar GDPs, we've also got to benchmark in terms of our health burden in Southern Africa in the context of third world challenges.
Now, Mr. Kommal, also staying with you, would you say that there's a lack of true generic price factors a factor in this matter?
I do think so. I do think in terms of cost drug pricing, because I travel quite extensively and network with a lot of my colleagues internationally, a lot of the margins on these drugs at a minimum are nothing less than 80 to 90% on a gross margin from what they imported from the actual manufacturing sites in India, Egypt and elsewhere. So if we were to say, well, we're benchmarking, the reality is, what are we benchmarking against? Profit margins or the real cost of landing those drugs here?
And now, Dr. Moodley, coming to you, the prices of cancer medication are generally expensive as per reports stating. What is the reason of this?
Well, in terms of how expensive or not drugs are, that is a complex process that you need to speak to the individual pharmaceutical companies that charge you X or Y for a particular drug. They have a pretty complicated mechanism on how they've got to the pricing, but at the end of the day, for them, it is more or less what a particular situation will tolerate as to how much they charge you for those drugs. But I think there's another big issue here around the whole pricing process. You must remember that South Africa, in essence, as my colleague says, is two different countries. We have a largely what I would call indigent population. In other words, a population where the treatment is supplied by the state. And that has a completely different pricing structure to the so-called private part of the South African market. And historically, the private market has to some degree subsidized the costing of these drugs for the state facility. I think the bigger issue in terms of drug supply is actually supply to the bigger population of South Africans that don't get this life-saving treatment, which are indigent South African women. So I think there is the bigger burden, and therein lies the bigger difference we can make in terms of drug access for South Africans.
And now, Dr. Moodley, also staying with you, what can actually be done to actually amend this matter at hand and to actually lower the prices of this life-saving treatment?
Well, that's a discussion that needs to be in context between the role players, that is, advocacy organizations, as they're doing now, the pharmaceutical industry, as is happening now, and government in terms of making sure that South Africans aren't being taken advantage of.
And now, Dr. Kommal, coming to you, what policies or interventions can actually be used to rectify this entire situation?
I think there needs to be, as my esteemed colleague mentioned, a cooperative effort between industry advocacies as well as the health department as an overarching entity. I do believe from a policy level there are engagements from government, but there needs to be more detailed engagements because we need to balance profitability versus life-saving drugs. And as much as, you know, on one hand we've got to say we've got to make it affordable, the other side you've got to make profit, there needs to be a collective understanding from government of what these products actually cost. Now, I am aware that government does a fair amount of these benchmarking discussions and conferences, etc. But the real cost is quite simple. If government were to be willing to go to the actual manufacturers, because a large volume of these drugs and medication are not manufactured by the brands themselves, and without mentioning groups, most of the larger groups use custom manufacturers in various countries who manufacture and then label these drugs for them. You can then, as an entity or as government, go to them and say, what are the actual costs and what can we import them for? I'm acutely aware that the margins of a lot of these products, including cancer medication, have margins of 80 to 90%. They are expensive, no doubt, for industry players to bring them in. But it does not justify then an exclusivity for a phenomenal margin, which a lot of the players, which again, and I say it with great respect to my colleagues, in the healthcare space that actively participate, in maintaining higher price margins because of exclusivity and import processes.
And now, Dr. Moodley, coming to you, this is a very new investigation and it's still at its very much early stages of the entire collusion saga of the pharmaceutical companies coming together into price fixing of cancer medication treatment. Do you think that regulations need to be very strict in this entire department?
Well, I think it's in some respects regulations that have got us to this point. The single exit pricing and the benchmarking in terms of how much these people were allowed to charge for this product is regulated. So that really hasn't helped us up to now there. If you're talking about being able to access cheaper medications earlier, one of that processes involves patent protection. That's also regulation. So on one hand, regulation helps you, and on the other hand, regulation hinders you. So I think unless you get all the players around the table and get to an amicable solution, which most importantly gets care to the women that need it, I think until that process becomes tantamount and profit and profitability and also making money from the whole process on all fronts, and that includes medical insurers, until that process is better managed, you're never going to get a solution that benefits individual patients.
And now, Dr. Kommal, what's your reaction with regards to what Dr. Moodley has just said, saying that a regulation at one hand helps you and sometimes actually hinders you? What do you make of this, and what can be done to actually solve the entire regulatory boards looking into, these pharmaceutical companies?
I do agree with my colleague to a large extent that a regulation does hinder to a large, it creates processes that are there to regulate, but it does create a hindrance. So I'm in full agreement with my colleague. The challenge we find with that, just to take it a bit further, is regulation itself needs to be informed by more realistic information. Because the reality is the DOH forms policies and prices and single exiting based on information given to them by the players in the industry. But they need to go, as I suggested earlier, one step beyond. Don't talk to the importers. Don't talk to the distributors. Talk to the manufacturers. Talk to those industries at the source. But again, as my colleague had rightfully pointed out, there are issues of patents, etc., but patents do expire. Not all medication is patented. So there are specific drug lines that may be patented, and some of them the patents may have expired. We then need to collectively make that decision and have those discussions of how far is government willing to go to engage in these processes? Because the reality is I've traveled extensively in India and I work with a lot of my colleagues in the pharmaceutical spaces. And we know aggressively that there are drug lines that are not even brought to South Africa as generics because some industry players won't allow it. I was on a presidential tour in 2010 in which at least 3 pharmaceutical CEOs insisted to be included on the business tour only because they wanted to make sure they protected their business interests. Traveling with the president then in 2010 was not about finding opportunities. It was about protecting the supply lines because there were opportunities created by the government of India at that point, which I know specifically in 2010, in which pharmaceutical players wanted to engage with government. Our government went across with the first state visit with President Zuma, but it was blocked to a large extent by specific industry players who participated in that because we knew from the time we left South Africa what they were going there for. So it is distressing that some players will do whatever they need to do, rightfully so from a capitalistic perspective, but from a socialistic perspective of South Africa having urgent health needs, that needs to be balanced between profit and saving lives.
Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the both of you for joining us this morning right here on 8 on 7. Well, that was Dr. Terrence Kommal, the medical expert, and also joining us was the oncologist, Dr. Shaun Moodley, just unpacking more details on the Competition Commission's announcement of a probe against price fixing of cancer medication amongst large pharmaceutical companies in South Africa.